I'm really excited to spend some time this morning talking a little bit about evolutionary ideas and how we think behavioral science can really help us to out-innovate our competitors. Some thinking as to sort of the philosophy behind this idea and arm us with some tools, some approaches, some ways of thinking that can start to bridge the gap between what might sort of seem like novel contemporary behavioral theory and really sort of tangible application. And when we talk about evolution and evolutionary ideas, we also sort of have quite often a revolutionary appetite. We love big ideas, disruptive technology, viral campaigns, circuit breakers. We have this sort of insatiable appetite for the novel and the new. And when we look at problem solving, it's very often for us to think that sort of big problems need big ideas or need big solutions, right? Certainly if it's a problem that I've not seen before or a problem that I've not been exposed before, then certainly we need something quite novel by which to solve it. And this is really an element of proportionality and what's often known as a proportionality bias. Starting to use the chat just to sort of get us on here for a moment. I noticed the other weekend, I have a 2-year-old daughter, and she filled the watering can outside, and there were 2 pot plants. There was a pot plant on the left and a pot plant on the right. And I just want to see, and I'll see if I can see the chat, which pot plant she poured the majority of the water into. Was it the pot plant on the left or the pot plant on the right? See if I can see my chat here. Here we go.
A couple of lefties.
So more water on the left. Actually, a couple on the. So we're getting it on a split. So what's really interesting is that actually she poured only a fraction of the water into the small pot plant, and then she emptied the whole barrel really into the big plant. And this is a good example of a concept in psychology known as magnitude matching. We think that sort of big outcomes deserve big inputs. It can be very hard for us to imagine that a mosquito, something as small as a mosquito, can be responsible for something as devastating as yellow fever. There's a lot of theory in conspiracies that it must be how can a lone gunman possibly have assassinated the leader of the free world, right? That input, that sort of action can't marry up to that outcome. There's some really lovely research done in the 60s around craps adding captions, so you can see that on the screen. Thank you very much. Let me see if I can switch that off. Better. Thanks, Dan. For craps players in casinos, they found that actually if a player needed to roll a low number, so a 3, they found that players rolled the dice quite lightly. If you needed to roll a high number, like an 8 or a 12, they found that players rolled the dice a little bit harder, a little bit stronger. Right? We have this sort of sense of proportionality. A big outcome needs a big input. So it's a problem of proportionality when we start to think about this challenge of big problems need big ideas. Big ideas requires revolutionary thinking. Revolutionary thinking requires sort of absolute novelty, disruption, circuit breaking technology. But actually there's a lot of value to be found in what already exists. I'm going to step change slightly to talk around trains. So a presentation on psychology, but want to reference some technical innovation that occurred in trains. And more specifically, I'll talk about how the kingfisher, the owl, and the Adelie penguin can help to shift design of trains, of engineering solutions. And it's not any train we're talking about this morning, but we're talking about the train on the Tokaido Shinkansen, so the Japanese speed train. So the Tokaido Shinkansen connects Tokyo with Osaka. It's a 515-kilometer stretch of rail. And Ijai Nakatsu was challenged, the GM of the engineering firm at the time was challenged to increase or reduce the time by which the speed trains could pass along this line down to 2.5 hours. And what was really interesting in face of this challenge is that actually the trains were absolutely capable of reaching these speeds. The trains could reach these speeds. What was the issue was actually the noise that the trains were making as they went across the line, that were actually sort of over the sounds of Japanese regulations. And one of the factors that was sort of leading to this noise was an element on the train called a pantograph. And the pantograph on the top of the train that we can see here connects the train to its electricity source. And at the time, this was creating sort of massive turbulence and creating lots of sort of vortexes of air that was creating a lot of sound, again, boosting that above the Japanese regulations. So what's sort of fascinating about the story is that while Ijai was the technical engineer on the program, he was also an avid bird watcher. So to bring some of his interests, some of his experience from discovering and understanding birds, he brought this into engineering. And they designed a new pantograph, but they designed this new pantograph based on two birds. The first being the owl. A nocturnal predator, the owl needs to swoop in silently to stun its prey. And what we find on owl feathers is actually they have what's known as micro serrations on the feathers. So they break these sort of turbulences up into micro turbulences to reduce and dissipate the nature of the sound. So what they did was they created this wing structure on the pantograph with serrations on the edges that can start to actually break these massive vortexes of air into micro turbulences. And the second inspiration was the Adelie penguin. The Adelie penguin that is a spindle-shaped penguin that can dart around the ocean to escape the leopard seals and again stun its prey. And they borrowed a similar shape from the Adelie penguin into this pantograph to increase its aerodynamics and reduce the turbulence and the vortexes, reducing the sound. So that's the owl and the Adelie penguin. The final challenge that they faced on this program wasn't the pantograph, but actually a challenge with tunnel booms. As the train entered many tunnels across the Tokaido Shinkansen, actually what was produced is a bit like a pistol firing from a gun. Sort of the train and the compressed air that was forced within the tunnel created a massive sonic boom. So how can we start to reduce this sonic boom? Again, borrowing from biology, borrowing from birds, they explored the kingfisher. Again, a master of plunging into water that's 800 times denser than air to stun its prey. So borrowing from the aerodynamics of the kingfisher, they can then design, and they did design the nose of the 500 series train that ended up sort of increasing speeds by 10%, reducing the sort of electrical use by 15%, and achieving their time thresholds and reducing noise. So that's a bit of a side story, and why are we talking about trains in a conversation about psychology, I suppose, is the critical question. And the reason behind it is that the work that was conducted on the Tokaido Shinkansen is a great example of a burgeoning field known as biomimicry. So biomimicry is essentially borrowing from nature to apply it and adapt it to the world around us today. So we might sort of have seen on the top left-hand side the story of Velcro, that George de Mestral, a Swiss engineer but also a mountaineer, found that sort of he continually had burrs that collected on his socks and his dog, and that sort of led to the innovation of Velcro. In the middle, we can see here, actually, there's a fascinating business in the US called Whale Power. They found that actually borrowing from the tubercles of whale fins, we can reduce the drag and maintain the lift in wind turbines. So rather than starting sort of engineering from scratch, we can borrow from a 3.8 billion year sort of research and development period. If something is alive around us today, it's got to be something good. There's got to be something in there that we can adapt and use it to solve contemporary human problems. And for us, I think most compellingly, behavioral science also isn't new. Despite the fact that there's lots of fantastic discussion around contemporary behavioral science, fundamentally, we've been deploying elements of behavioral theory, inadvertently stumbling across robust behavioral solutions organically in our day-to-day practice. We have adapted and evolved just like nature in our own solutions. For eons, restaurateurs have filled their windows, their restaurants from the front windows back to normalize patronage. So they make it seem really busy to increase the norm of people coming into the restaurant. If you've ever seen a recommended retail price with a big red line through it, that's known as an anchoring heuristic. Again, a powerful element of behavioral science. A closing down scale is a scarcity driver. Again, we've seen these for eons. Now we better understand the psychology. Even putting the price tag on the bottom of products within a store subtly nudges people to pick them up. Right? By having the price tag on the bottom of an item, shopkeepers in their infinite wisdom sort of manage to get the product in someone's hand as a subtle commitment to purchasing the product. So these adaptations are actually all around us. While some elements of behavioral science are new, actually the implementation, the adaptations, the evolved solutions are there that we can play with. So again, to remind us, so rather than thinking, wow, we need to revolutionize and maybe behavioral science is key to revolution, it's actually an integral part of evolving and looking at adaptations and evolution to drive these solutions. Rather than thinking about biology, like might have been helpful for the Tokaido Shinkansen, borrowing from the kingfisher, the owl, and the Adelie penguin, now we can start to think about psychology and psychological adaptation and psychological evolution. Rather than the science of physics that enabled us to bridge the natural world with a train, we're able to actually now bring the codification of behavioral science. So the language, the vernacular behind many of the patterns that we see in human behavior and psychology to begin to bring these sort of adapted solutions to novel real world problems. And words really matter. Words really do matter. What we can say, we can see, and what we see, we can apply. So there's lots of really sort of important discussion around the codification of behavioral science within the industry. There are many different biases, heuristics that are being established and circulated, and whether this is sort of simplifying our understanding of human behavior or whether this is arming us with something quite powerful. And I wanted to sort of talk about why I think this codification is really powerful, certainly from sort of a pragmatic application perspective, by talking a little bit about color and color perception. Fundamentally, humans have the same biological processes to perceive color, and color itself is just a series of light wavelengths, right? And if we look at the English language, and if we look at these sort of spectrums of color beneath us, we see those as blue. So the category is blue, albeit we see some as lighter blue or darker blue, but categorically they're blue. In Russian, for example, they have sort of two different categories of color codification for blue. So lighter shades of blue called goluboy and sinil on the darker shades. So categorically different colors. And what you find on a distinction task, if you're asking people to sort of create a distinction or identify a distinction between colors, Russian speakers are 10% faster in identifying the difference between these two categorical sides of color. While in English, it's blue, in Russian, it's categorically distinct. By creating a different category, by creating a different code, our brain can perceive things more easily, and we can process them and act on them. So when we think, and many of us might have seen this shade, this image here. of near sort of 200 different cognitive biases, this codex of all this information, and is this helpful? How might it be sort of, again, simplifying our process, and how might it take us forward? And as you saw on that sort of codex, there are many different biases and heuristics of sort of human behavior or patterns of human behavior that have been identified. One sort of summary of some of these different biases is a framework known as Mindspace. It's not an Ogilvy framework, it's a framework that was developed by the Behavioural Insights team, the Institute for Government, and the Cabinet Office in the UK. And Mindspace is an acronym that boils down sort of decades of psychological research into 9 core principles of human behaviour. So this might be the beginning of our fruit salad. We'll add the apple, we'll add the banana, and if we can find it, we'll add the Tangelo. But by having these codes, we can start to sort of bridge this gap between theory. So M stands for the messenger effect. We know that who delivers information can be often more powerful than the information itself. Stanley Milgram found that simply asking people to don a white jacket can encourage people to put sort of potentially fatal voltages through an unsuspected sort of participant. So who is the messenger that we might use? How might we think about that messenger as just as important as the message in shaping our behavior? I in Mindspace is for incentives, and incentives in this sort of element of the fruit salad. Here is where we talk about concepts like loss aversion. Lots of research has demonstrated that humans are twice as motivated to avoid a loss than we are to receive a gain. So how might we illustrate what people might stand to lose without engagement? Incentives is also where we talk about concepts like scarcity. We saw that before in our closing down sale. If things become scarce, we fear we might miss out on it, and so we value it more. N is for norms. We're herd creatures. So if we can identify the behavior of others around us, and we can make decision-making more easy, we can reinforce trust in an outcome. D is for defaults. It's really expensive for humans to think. It costs us a lot of sugar, a lot of glucose, a lot of calories to sort of activate our distinctively sort of human brain. So we tend not to do that too often. And what this means is we can actually build an environment, we can build a sort of a process or a flow that elicits our behavior, our desired behavior naturally. One of the flagship cases of defaults was looking at organ donation between Austria and Germany. In Austria, organ donation was up to 99%. In Germany, it was around 12%. And the researchers explored whether this was a cultural difference or a religious difference, but actually the sort of the critical difference is the process of signing up for organ donation. In Austria, you needed to sign off. In Germany, you needed to sign in. The default in Austria is that everyone is an organ donor until otherwise, and that significantly shifted the outcome. S is for salience. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. Similarly, priming and effect, but move sort of just now to commitment being the C in Mindspace. We seek to be consistent with how we present ourselves to the world. If we can make a subtle pledge or a subtle statement, or we see ourselves, that we identify ourselves with an outcome, we're more likely to follow through with it. So signatory sign-offs can be immensely powerful in shaping our actions and encouraging us to follow through. And finally, E is for ego. We do things that make us feel better about ourselves. So one of the suspicions for the Toyota Prius and the success of the Toyota Prius is that it's such an ugly car. That when we see it driving down the street, people know, or we're driving it down the street, people know we must be doing something good for the environment. Right? It becomes a signal, a virtue signal that makes ourselves feel good, rather than actually a belief in saving the planet as much. So Mindspace is a really fantastic framework. Again, it's starting to take over 100 different frameworks from psychology into a simple 9-stage model. Now, this isn't a dramatic reveal, a public reveal of some exciting news. I wanted to talk now about how can we start to access these insights from psychology and apply them to our day-to-day. And I had a moment a couple of years ago that was sort of a defining stage for me in my practice of behavioral science. And it happened actually at lunch with my wife and her family. and her cousin was talking about the time that she was pregnant with her second baby. And she knew the sex of the baby, her husband knew the sex of the baby, and her young daughter knew the sex of the baby, but no one else in the family knew. And as you imagine, for eons, not eons, that's far too long. For weeks and weeks, everyone sort of interrogated this poor girl, asking, "What's the gender of the baby? Is it a boy or a girl? What's the gender of the baby?" And amazingly, she said nothing. She kept tight-lipped for months, until someone asked a slightly different question. Rather than asking, is it a boy or a girl, or what's the gender of the baby going to be? Someone asked, what's the name of the baby going to be? And to that question, she said, Sophia. And when I heard this story, for me, sort of the penny dropped on our approach to behavioral science. Behavioral science gives us a different code, a different codex, a way of thinking, again, a sort of a fruit salad by which we can arm ourselves with different questions. If we can ask a different question, then we can get a different answer. We can expand our sort of space for solutions to accelerate innovation. And what's really interesting now, if we again go back to our analogy of evolution, our analogy of the Tokaido Shinkansen, and how sort of natural adaptations can help us to fuel our innovation. That a rich and vast resource of applied behavioral sciences in the world around us anyway. So rather than simply sort of relying on peer-reviewed academic journals to give us a steer, we can use these as sort of a fundamental code by which we can seek inspiration from the world around us. So let's look for a moment at salience, at how the principle of salience can arm us in ideation, and how some of the inspiration from the world around us can support this. Our attention is drawn to what's sort of novel or most relevant to us. What sort of captures our attention, is personalized, is of contrast and feedback. So this is a selection of examples of adaptations of salience that we can borrow from, that might ask us a slightly different question than simply how do we make it brighter? How might we actually sort of change how people see us by borrowing from a familiar concept? So if we want someone to sort of process that it's slippery, how might we borrow a code from an existing concept? How might we chunk a process up by using numbers or by using colors? Right? These are sort of two new fuels, two new levers by which we can make something salient. The clever people at Kleenex Professional, they found actually when you get to the bottom of a box of tissues of Kleenex Professional, the color actually changes. It goes a little bit blue, a lovely salient feedback loop that helps people who are changing the tissues to know when the tissues need to be changed. How might we provide a sense of visual feedback as people get closer to our desired behavior? Again, this natural adaptation gives us a slightly different question. Similarly, the clever people at Dulux found it was very different to paint white ceilings with white paint because you don't have this sense of salient feedback loop. It's very hard to see where you've painted. So they created a style of paint that goes on pink and dries white. So how might we make the invisible elements of a behavior visible in order to encourage it? What might we make sort of more visible in the process? Some clever chemists in the US have developed a style of nail polish that goes on pink, and when it's in touch with a date rape drug like Rohypnol, it turns black. So if you stir your drink with your finger and your nail polish goes black, you can see that your drink has been spiked. Again, a similar salient feedback loop to our team in Dulux, but I suspect not driven by a team of behavioral scientists, but by a team of chemists. But similarly, we can borrow from this natural adaptation into our work. So in doing so, our team in Dubai developed a lovely solution with Nestle to encourage children to drink more water. Again, another classic problem that doesn't have a salient feedback loop. It's very hard to encourage kids to drink water when you don't sort of immediately feel any different. You don't feel better for it. How can we close this salient feedback loop? How can we be more like a Dulux pink or a nail polish that turns black when it comes to consuming water? So what we developed was an app and a narrative called Tummy Fish. And you could hold your phone up to your stomach, and if you drank water, if our kids reported to drink water, the fish would grow and swim happily, and whereas if you had a soft drink, the water would go murky and cloudy and the fish would get a little bit sick. So we're starting to close this salient feedback loop or create a feedback loop in hydration. Our team in London focused on a slightly similar challenge, looking at hand hygiene behavior. And again, hand hygiene, cleaning your hands is another challenge where you have very little salient feedback. It's very hard to see the microbacteria that's sort of disappearing as we wash our hands. So to create a salient feedback loop, we developed a hand stamp, a stamp that goes on, you sort of stamp your hand. It's a dirty looking E. coli, and you stamp your hand as you go through a hand washing process. And this was in a food processing plant. And as workers went through, you can see sort of stamping our hands, and we gave people something to wash off. We created a salient feedback loop that people could clean. And what we found is a sort of a significant 63% reduction in contaminated hands simply by closing this feedback loop, by learning from Dulux, from our clever chemists, from work in hydration to hand hygiene behavior, a $2 solution with a multi-million-dollar outcome with respect to brand recall and worker health. So if we think of sort of salience even as one pocket of areas in asking different questions, we can not only go to the theory, but natural adaptations and evolved solutions, psychological adaptations, just like our kingfisher, our owl, our Adelie penguin. Let's look for a moment at priming. Our behavior can be shaped by subtle sounds and scents and words and cues. And this is a lovely example of sort of natural priming. It's a recent study that's been working in Africa to try to reduce the number of cows that are taken by lions. They've found it's really early results, but by painting eyes on the back of cows, you can reduce the owls lost to lions by creating the sense that the lions are being watched. And that's sort of an adaptation that's driving now. But for many years, we've explored, as psychologists explored, what's known as the watching eye effect in moral behaviors and antisocial behaviors like theft. And with some really great research to how priming someone with the sense of being watched can reduce antisocial behavior. But in an extension of this, and again, an extension of how the sense of priming through subtle cues and subtle imagery can achieve an outcome. The same is true from sort of watching eyes to embracing the round face and round eyes of babies, a process that's commonly deployed by brands like Disney in making our cartoons. And this has been found actually to sort of release an oxytocin response, make us more pro-social when impacted by this sort of stimuli. So in an experiment that we ran in London, we painted babies' faces on shop fronts during the London riots to see if we can stem antisocial behaviour on the streets of Greenwich. And this simple execution, this adaptation of an existing approach by Disney onto the streets of London, we found initially an 18% reduction in crime, and that's since been, we're working with Oxford University, and that looks to be extended to around 24% reduction in crime with something so small as painting babies' faces on shop fronts to elicit this response, to prime us with the sense of social cohesion. And finally, I'll talk to affect. I'm conscious I've been talking longer than is helpful for a moment, but just touch on affect, just another area of psychology that we can learn from. That our emotions heavily shape our actions. And when we look at affect as psychologists, it's not always just like what emotion we want to elicit in someone, but also what emotion someone might be bringing to a particular circumstance. And we know, for example, we're more likely to buy high-calorie foods if we go shopping when we're hungry. We know, for example, that men in a cold state of arousal might say, yes, I'd 100% use a condom, whereas in a hot state of arousal, that behavior might be very different, right? So we have what's known as a hot-cold empathy gap. So what might be a default that we can put in place to prevent this outcome from occurring? So our emotions, unsurprisingly, heavily shape our actions. So let's start to think about this, and again with sort of two adaptations. One that's a toy that we bought our daughter, and the other is a campaign in South Africa, and both really sort of tapping into natural adaptations of affect. On the left-hand side, I thought sort of a genius solution. How do we get kids to pack away their toys, make the pack away process part of the game by having the shapes of the blocks on the lid, and it makes it easier, makes it fun for us to pack away our toys. Similarly, on the right-hand side, this is one of my favorite sort of pieces of applied behavioral science that might seem so easy. It's essentially encouraging children to wash their hands. How do you get children to wash their hands? Embed a toy in the middle of a bar of soap, and kids are sort of furiously cleaning their hands to get to the car, and their hands are clean by default. So what's the question this might give us? What's already motivating? What's already motivating our audience? And how might we embed this into our product? It's already motivational to see that feeling of a block going through the right square. Let's make that part of the packing up process. It's already motivating to get a toy car. Let's whack that in the middle of a bar of soap. Many of us might have seen this sort of image, and it might make them cringe if you've seen this kind of video in the past. It's a good example of a concept known as pattern deviancy. We find this sort of deviancy, this distortion, really uncomfortable. There's some interesting research that's explored the relationship between pattern deviancy and dislike of pattern deviancy and the dislike of social deviancy. We sort of break expectations, we break the beauty of an expected pattern, and this makes us inherently uncomfortable. This is a really interesting sort of psychological charge that we can gravitate towards. How might we actually make people feel uncomfortable so they act? A slightly different question, right? Slightly different effective question to how might we make it fun? Can we elicit a sense of discomfort? Can we make an action feel incomplete so that people are nudged to close the loop? In taking this thinking or adapting these insights somewhat inadvertently, Louvre Brum has developed an amazing light switch, so a designer. And essentially the light switch, when the light is switched off, creates this beautiful sort of zebra pattern. But when the light is turned on, it creates this pattern deviancy. So we're forever subtly nudged to make sure we switch the lights off after ourselves. So again, a lovely sort of looking at the sort of applied sort of natural adaptations of this in the world around us, applied to a novel solution like switching our lights off, like energy consumption. So that's a little bit about Mindspace. It's a framework that can help become sort of a foundational code for navigating, sort of bridging the gap between psychological theory and solutions. But what's important, and I'll talk in a moment, this is some of this thinking, a lot of this thinking is work for a book that will be released next year, is shifting from a principle-led thinking, so from driving from the messenger effect or incentives or norms, to thinking about universal problems that some of these heuristics and biases can consistently solve, like reinforcing loyalty, like boosting trust, like shifting perceptions of value. How might we shape perceptions of value without increasing or decreasing the price itself? How might we boost the experience or the memory of an experience without changing its duration? How might we arm people to make different choices, better choices, without reducing the available choice set? There is a series of the most relevant elements of psychology and their natural adaptations that we can start to bring with these consistent challenges. So in closing, so behavioral science isn't new, but we think how we use it moving forward can be. By sort of seeking inspiration from sort of rich resources around us. Some of this that isn't in a textbook, but once we know the codes, we know what to look for. Remember the distinction in blue. Once we have a language, now we can see it very differently. And rather than talking about a small, sweet, crisp, sort of tri-colored fruit that's occasionally fermented, we can say, how about we try a grape? And let's look at the sort of grapes that we have at our disposal. And if we can convert this into a question, if we can convert this into a question that helps us to then generate it into new ideas. If we ask a different question, we'll get a different answer. And we can drive innovation through sort of evolution, through reapplying what already exists rather than revolution, seeking something that's a complete novel step change actually.